The attic had been shut for decades. It was the kind of room that seemed to breathe on its own, exhaling a musty scent of trapped summers and forgotten winters. The air was heavy, as though every particle of dust had been holding its place in the same shaft of sunlight since 1966. Clara Bennett hadn't meant to open it that day. She was only looking for an old sewing machine her grandmother had promised her before she passed. But the floorboard creaked in a way she'd never heard before, a hollow knock that suggested something beneath. She knelt, pried it up, and found a weathered wooden box, the size of a shoebox. The lid stuck before giving way with a reluctant sigh, and there it was, a rusted tin canister, the kind she'd only seen in documentaries. Around it, yellowed paper scraps, gas receipts, grocery lists, and a faded postcard of Alder Creek Lake. Across the canister's lid, in the wavering handwriting of someone who hadn't thought much about the future, were the words, Summer 66. She didn't know what she expected to feel, maybe mild curiosity, but instead the sight struck her like a sudden drop in temperature. This wasn't her family's handwriting. In fact, it wasn't from her family at all. It was from the Marwicks. The name had a weight in Alder Creek even now, an echo you could still hear if you walked along the creek on a still evening. They had vanished without a trace one summer day, leaving behind nothing but half-finished dinners and questions no one dared to answer. Clara had grown up with whispers about them, but never the full story. Her fingers brushed the cool, almost oily surface of the canister. Inside was the fragile coil of 8mm film, its edges slightly warped, smelling faintly of vinegar, a scent any archivist would tell you meant decay was already at work. She set the canister down gently, afraid that even her breath could damage it. The dust in the air danced through the afternoon light in tiny galaxies, turning the attic into a world far removed from the present. For a moment, she was sure she heard the faint, almost mechanical clicking of a projector, though the attic was still and empty. Something about the way the reel sat inside that box didn't feel right. It wasn't just forgotten, it was hidden. Her mind spun with questions she couldn't yet name. Who had put it here? Why had it been in her grandmother's attic? And why, after all these years, did her hands tremble like she was about to read a confession? Later, she would realize there was something else unusual about the reel, something no one could explain. One of its frames was missing. Not damaged. Not accidentally torn. Removed. But for now, the only sound was her heartbeat and the creak of the attic floor, as the dust settled back into place, like it had been waiting for her all along. In the summer of 1966, Alder Creek was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked. It sat, cradled between low green hills, with a two-lane main street lined by clapboard storefronts and a diner that smelled like coffee and fried pie. The days passed slowly, the sunrise stretching across wheat fields, evenings filled with the hum of cicadas. People knew each other's names, birthdays, and the way their laugh sounded after one too many beers. And they knew the Marwicks. Thomas and Eleanor, both in their early 30s, had moved to Alder Creek in '59, seeking quieter lives after years in the bustle of Chicago. Thomas worked at the lumber mill. Eleanor taught part-time at the elementary school. They had 2 children, Emily, age 8, bright-eyed and constantly sketching flowers in a small notebook, and Peter, age 5, who had a gap-toothed grin and a habit of running just a little too far ahead when they walked. Neighbors remembered them as ordinary in the warmest sense. Picnics by the lake on Saturdays, Sunday morning pancakes, fireflies in mason jars. But with the passing years, some would admit there had been something else, a subtle watchfulness in Thomas's eyes, the way Eleanor seemed to glance over her shoulder in the middle of conversations. It was the last week of July when the weather shifted. Mornings were thick with the kind of humid air that made you feel underwater, and by afternoon, thunderstorms rolled in with sudden, violent downpours. On the 29th, the Marwicks told neighbors they were headed for an afternoon picnic at Alder Creek before the rain set in. Several people saw them that day. At 2:15 p.m., they were at Moore's gas station, Thomas filling the Chevy's tank while Emily and Peter shared a root beer on the front bench. Eleanor leaned against the hood, smiling faintly. By 3 o'clock, they were spotted by the bridge, walking toward the shaded bank of the creek. At 4:20, a local fisherman swore he saw them on the far side of the water, packing up as storm clouds gathered overhead. That was the last confirmed sighting. By evening, Rain lashed against every roof in Alder Creek. The storm knocked out power for nearly 3 hours. Most folks stayed inside, riding out the weather. No one thought about the Marwicks until the next morning, when the Miller boy came knocking at Sheriff Conway's office. He had gone to play with Peter, only to find the Marwick house eerily still. The front door was unlocked. On the kitchen counter, plates were set out with sandwiches, one half-bitten. The radio was on, humming low static between stations. Upstairs, the children's beds were neatly made, their favorite toys stacked at the foot, except for Peter's red wooden truck, which lay on its side near the back door. The Chevy was still parked in the driveway, driver's door ajar. In the passenger seat was a folded blanket and a wicker picnic basket, damp but intact. No footprints in the yard. No signs of a struggle. No notes. Sheriff Conway organized a search that stretched through the next 3 days. Officers, neighbors, even volunteers from the next county over, combing the creek, the woods, and the hills beyond. Bloodhounds caught a faint scent near the water, but it vanished 50 yards downstream. By the end of the week, the search was called off. Official reports used words like mystery and unresolved disappearance. Locals used other words: curse, taken, gone for good. Over the years, the Marwick's absence became a story told in hushed tones to newcomers. A ghost story without ghosts, a warning without an explanation. And though time dulled the fear, it never erased the unease. Some say the town didn't want the truth, because the truth would have been worse than the mystery. Clara didn't take the real to the police. At least, not yet. Something about it felt too fragile, too personal, to hand over to strangers with gloves and clipboards. She needed to see it first, to know what it was before it became a piece of evidence, locked away in a drawer. She called Samuel Rhodes, the town's unofficial historian. He was in his 70s now, with the kind of memory that could tell you what song was playing on the jukebox the night the Marwicks vanished. If anyone could help, it was him. They met in Samuel's study, a cramped room filled with books that smelled of paper and dust, and a humming old projector that looked as though it had been rescued from a school basement decades ago. Clara placed the canister on the table, as though setting down a newborn. Samuel lifted the lid and whistled softly. Kodachrome 8mm, he said, almost to himself. They haven't made stock like this in 50 years. He pinched the reel gently between his fingers, holding it to the light. Still mostly intact. Amazing. He threaded the film into the projector with the care of a surgeon, his hands steady despite his age. The bulb warmed, filling the room with a low electric hum. The first flicker of light hit the white pull-down screen, and for a heartbeat, it was just the two of them, Clara and Samuel, watching time rewind itself. The picture came into focus. The Marwicks, alive again. Emily and Peter ran through a field barefoot, the grass bowing under the weight of their steps. Eleanor sat on a blanket, hair curling under a summer hat, smiling in a way that was both bright and guarded. Thomas, behind the camera, occasionally swung it toward himself in a jerky, almost reluctant self-portrait, his expression unreadable. The film was silent, but Clara swore she could hear laughter, the kind that feels more like a memory than a sound. The scenes rolled on, the children tossing bread to ducks at the creek, Eleanor reading a book in the shade, Thomas handing the camera to someone else so he could lift Peter onto his shoulders. It should have been beautiful. It was beautiful. But something was wrong. It wasn't one big thing, no monster in the background, no sudden shadow lunging into frame. It was the smallness of it. A fleeting glance from Eleanor toward the treeline. The way Emily's smile faltered mid-laugh as her eyes tracked something just out of view. At the 6-minute mark, the camera panned slowly, almost deliberately, toward the woods. For less than a second, a tall, narrow shape could be seen between the trunks. Too far to make out details, but too still to be wind or animal. Clara leaned forward in her chair, her stomach tightening. Then it happened. Mid-laugh, as Peter chased Emily toward the car, the picture jumped. Not a glitch. Not a tear. A splice. One frame gone. And the cut was too clean, the kind of surgical absence that meant someone had taken scissors to the film. When the reel ended, the screen went white. The projector's hum seemed suddenly loud, almost oppressive. Samuel leaned back slowly, his eyes still on the blank screen. "I've seen a lot of old film," he said quietly. "And I've seen my share of bad splices. But this was deliberate. Someone didn't want us to see that frame." Clara sat in silence. The image of the children frozen mid-run burned into her mind. She could feel the attic dust still clinging to her hands, could still smell the faint chemical tang of the reel. The past wasn't just whispering to her. It was breathing. Samuel didn't sleep that night. By morning, he had already called in a favor from a friend, a retired film restoration expert named Martin Vega, who lived 2 towns over. Martin had spent decades repairing brittle newsreels, wedding footage, even archival war film. He knew how to coax secrets out of celluloid the way a watchmaker listens to gears. Clara and Samuel arrived at Martin's workshop the next afternoon. It was a place where the air seemed permanently scented with old film stock and isopropyl alcohol. The walls were lined with metal reels in neatly labeled boxes. A large flat light table sat in the middle, its surface glowing faintly like a shallow pool of milk. Martin took the reel from its canister, holding it up to the fluorescent light overhead. The film strip glinted, tiny frozen worlds locked inside each frame. He squinted. You weren't kidding," he murmured. "This splice is intentional. Clean cut. Done with a guillotine splicer. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing." He laid the film across the light table and began to wind it slowly, frame by frame, his gloved fingers steady. Clara leaned over, trying not to blink. The familiar picnic scenes passed under the magnifier but slowed to a crawl. At this speed, they were almost unbearable to watch, each frame a still life, a fragment of a life paused mid-motion. Emily's hair catching the sun, Peter's hand mid-wave, Eleanor's lips parted as if about to speak. Then came the details neither Clara nor Samuel had seen before. In one frame, the shadow between the trees was more defined than they'd realized. Broad-shouldered, elongated, with the faintest outline of a head turning toward the camera. In the next frame, it was gone entirely, as if it had simply evaporated. Another frame showed a pale blur at the edge of the creek. Too small to be a person, too still to be a trick of water. Martin adjusted the light, frowning. "That's not damage," he said. "That's in the negative." They kept going. Halfway through, they found something even stranger. In a moment where Thomas was panning the camera toward Eleanor, Emily's mouth formed words. Slow enough now, Clara could read them. "Behind you." The next frame, her smile was back, bright and easy as if nothing had happened. Clara felt the air in the room tighten. She wanted to speak, but found her throat dry. Samuel leaned on the table, his knuckles white. "If that missing frame is right after this moment." He didn't finish the sentence. When they reached the splice, frame 247, Martin removed his glasses and exhaled. "See here." He pointed to the microscopic fraying at the cut. "That's decades old. Not recent. Whoever removed this did so shortly after it was filmed. Which means they were still alive when it was taken out," Samuel finished. Martin spooled the rest of the reel through the projector for comparison. The hum filled the workshop, flickering images casting moving shadows across their faces. Clara noticed something she hadn't before. Tiny double exposures in certain frames, like ghost images bleeding through. One in particular showed Eleanor's hand reaching out, fingers curled in a way that suggested urgency, not play. "This isn't just home footage," Martin said finally. "This is a message. And someone made sure we'd only get part of it." Clara stared at the film strip, still glowing on the table. She couldn't help but think of the attic, the way the box had been hidden, the dust settling back around it like a seal. For the first time, she wondered if finding the reel had been an accident or an invitation. The film was one thing, but memories, that was another battlefield entirely. Clara and Samuel began knocking on doors, starting with those who had been teenagers in Alder Creek during the summer of '66. People who, in theory, might remember more than the official reports ever recorded. What they found wasn't a neat line of facts. It was a chorus of half-remembered moments, each warped by the decades, each carrying its own subtle tremor of fear. The fisherman's story Frank Heller was 79 now, living in a weathered cabin near the North Fork of the creek. His hands still smelled faintly of bait and river water. He leaned back in his chair and told them he'd seen the Marwicks that day, around 4 in the afternoon, packing their picnic under a sky bruising with storm. They looked jumpy, he said, tapping the armrest as though searching for the right word. Like folks who'd just seen a snake. When Samuel pressed him, Frank hesitated, then added, "And there was someone else. Across the water. Just standing." He stared at the wall for a long time. Tall fella. Didn't wave. Didn't move. The gas station attendant Mabel Tuck had been 17 then, working weekends at Moore's gas station. She remembered Thomas Marwick's Chevy pulling in, remembered the kids sharing a soda on the front bench. Nothing strange about it, she said at first. But then, she frowned. Except Eleanor didn't get out of the car. She was just sitting there, staring out the passenger window. Not at me. Past me. Like she was trying to see who was behind the station. The teenager on the hill, one of the most unsettling recollections came from Danny Cook, who had been 13 that summer. He lived on a hill overlooking part of the creek. He swore that during the storm, he'd looked out his bedroom window and seen lantern light moving along the bank. 3 quick flashes, then darkness. "I thought it was just folks caught in the rain," he said. "But the next day, when I heard they were gone, I kept thinking, what if it was them? What if they were signaling?" The woman in the diner, even the most mundane voices held odd edges. Betty Palmer, a waitress at Alder Creek Diner, recalled seeing Thomas 2 days before the disappearance. He'd sat alone at the counter, stirring his coffee so long she had to ask if he wanted a refill. When she joked about him looking like a man with the weight of the world, he'd smiled tightly and said, "Sometimes the world follows you, even when you move towns." The more Clara and Samuel collected, the less the accounts aligned. In one telling, the family seemed relaxed and happy. In another, they were visibly agitated. Some swore there was a stranger in town that week, a drifter no one knew. Others denied ever seeing anyone unfamiliar. But one thread kept surfacing, no matter who spoke. That day at the creek, there was something else. A presence just beyond reach, like a shadow in the corner of your eye. And no one, not then, not now, wanted to be the one to name it. By the time Clara closed her notebook that night, her hand ached from writing. Her mind was a fog of overlapping stories, each one contradicting the next, yet somehow adding up to a single undeniable truth. Whatever happened to the Marwicks, the town of Alder Creek had seen more than it was willing to admit. And now, with the real unspooled on the table, those old whispers weren't just history anymore. They were stirring again. Martin called them back 2 days later. His voice was calm, but there was a thin wire of urgency running under it. "I've isolated the splice," he said. "You need to see this." When Clara and Samuel arrived, the workshop was darker than before. The blinds were drawn, the only light coming from the illuminated frame table. The reel was already threaded through a Steinbeck editing machine, an old flatbed viewer with a pair of large spinning plates and a monitor in the center. Martin didn't waste time. He rolled the footage forward, letting the moments just before the splice play out at a glacial pace. Emily and Peter laughing, running toward the Chevy. Thomas in the background folding the picnic blanket. Eleanor closing the wicker basket, glancing toward the woods. "Watch the far left of the frame," Martin said quietly. Clara leaned in. The grain swam and shifted on the monitor, but then she saw it, a vertical form just inside the treeline. Not moving. Not waving. Just there. Martin froze the image. Even in the still, the figure had a strange presence. Slightly hunched but tall, with shoulders broader than Thomas's. The head seemed angled downward, as though watching something intently. "That's frame 246, Martin said. "Now watch this." He advanced the reel 1 click. The monitor went black for a fraction of a second. A perfect void where frame 247 should be. Then, with the next click, the image returned. Emily's foot mid-stride, Thomas now facing the car, Eleanor half-turned as if startled. The jump was so clean it was almost surgical. "It's not damage," Martin said. "It's deliberate removal. Someone took out that one frame, likely within days or weeks of filming, before the reel ever saw a projector." Clara's eyes stayed locked on the black space where the missing image should have been. "Why just one frame?" she asked. Samuel answered for her. "Because sometimes one moment is all it takes. One look, one movement that would have told us exactly who that was. Martin adjusted the playback speed and looped the seconds before and after the gap. The more Clara watched, the more she noticed. In frame 246, the figure in the trees had the faint outline of something in its hands, too indistinct to name, but cradled at chest height. In frame 248, Eleanor's posture had changed. Her weight shifted as though she had just taken a step backward. "You see her reaction," Martin said. Something happened in that split second. The room seemed smaller now, as though the air itself had drawn inward. Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. If we could find even a degraded copy of the full reel before it was spliced, maybe we'd see the missing frame. But whoever cut it probably destroyed the original piece. Martin hesitated. Or kept it. The idea lodged itself in Clara's mind like a splinter. The thought of someone somewhere holding a single frame of film that showed the truth, and choosing to keep it hidden, felt almost worse than the vanishing itself. Before they left, Martin zoomed into frame 246 one last time. The pixels broke apart into soft blocks of light and shadow, but the silhouette remained unmistakable. Tall. Watching. Waiting. Clara couldn't help herself. Do we know anyone in town from back then who matches that build? Samuel didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the figure, his jaw tight. "We might," he said finally. "But if I'm right, this just got a whole lot darker." As they stepped outside, the late afternoon sun felt too bright, too careless for what they'd just seen. In Clara's mind, frame 247 wasn't a missing piece anymore. It was a wound, precisely cut, intentionally hidden, and still bleeding questions nearly 60 years later. The reel hadn't belonged to the Marwicks when Clara found it. It had been tucked away in her grandmother's attic. Yes, but Samuel knew instantly whose hands it had passed through before that. Harold Wexler. Wexler had been the Marwicks' next-door neighbor. In the grainy black-and-white pages of the 1960s local paper, he appeared in the background of nearly every community event. Tall, lanky, his hair combed neatly back, a Super 8 camera often slung around his neck. He filmed everything, Samuel told Clara as they sat in the archives room, the musty air heavy with dust and paper. Parades, little league games, school recitals. He had this obsession with capturing moments. Thought film could keep things alive. Clara flipped through brittle photographs, each one showing Harold with that same faint smile. Pleasant but unreadable, like a man who was never fully in the moment he was living. The official record was sparse. Harold Wexler died in 1992. No children. No close family. He'd lived in the same house from 1954 until his death. But his filming stopped abruptly in the summer of 1966. They began asking around. At the corner store, Mrs. Davies, 84, sharp as a tack, remembered the last time she saw Wexler with his camera. "It was the day before the storm," she said, her hands tightening on the handle of her shopping cart. "He was on his porch, cleaning the lens. I remember because I asked if he'd be filming the church picnic, and he said, 'Not this year.'" She paused. That was strange. He never missed the picnic. Others remembered him differently. A former colleague from the lumber mill described Harold as meticulous, the kind of man who measured twice before cutting once. A neighbor's son recalled how Harold used to bring over small reels for backyard screenings, but never any from the summer of '66. It was as though that season had been cut from his life, just as frame 247 had been cut from the reel. In the county records office, Clara found a curious entry. In September 1966, less than 2 months after the Marwicks vanished, Harold purchased a reinforced lock for his attic door. "People don't just start locking their attics unless they have something to hide," Samuel muttered. The more they learned, the heavier the reel felt in Clara's mind. If Harold had the Marwicks footage, why didn't he turn it over when the investigation was fresh? Why tuck it away in his attic for nearly 3 decades? And how, after his death, had it ended up in her grandmother's? Samuel offered one theory, his voice low. Your grandmother and Harold went to the same church. Maybe he trusted her with it before he passed. Or maybe she found it and decided not to say anything. Clara's chest tightened. The thought that her own family might have been part of this long silence made the mystery feel colder. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the reel on the counter in front of her. The tin reflected the overhead light in a dull, wavering arc, like a moon seen through fog. Somewhere in the years between 1966 and now, Harold Wexler had stopped being a man with a camera and started being the keeper of a secret. Whether he had been protecting someone, or protecting himself, remained the question neither the footage nor the town seemed ready to answer. It happened by accident. Clara had been digging through the cedar chest in her grandmother's bedroom, looking for old church programs her mother had asked her to find. The chest smelled faintly of lavender and thyme itself, the air inside cool and dry despite the August heat. Beneath folded linens and a brittle lace shawl, she found another tin canister. No label. Just a faint scratch on the lid, as if someone had tried to rub off a name. Her breath caught. It was identical to the first. She carried it to Samuel, who didn't even open it before saying, "If this is what I think it is, we might be looking at something no one's seen since '66. When Martin threaded the second reel through the Steinbeck, the screen flickered to life with scenes instantly recognizable. Alder Creek's Main Street during a summer parade. The same camera's steady, slightly unpolished movements. The same Kodachrome colors. Too rich, almost dreamlike. But midway through, the footage shifted. There was the Marwick family again, though this time the setting was different. The creek bank. Emily, in a red gingham dress, crouched to touch the water. Peter balanced on a flat rock. Thomas and Eleanor were nearby, speaking quietly. Too quietly to read lips. Samuel leaned forward. This is the same day. They watched in silence until Martin's hand shot up to stop the reel. There. He rewound a few seconds, slowed the playback. The children had turned toward a sound, something out of frame. Eleanor's head tilted, brow furrowing. Then came a slow pan toward the water. At normal speed, nothing seemed odd. At half speed, you could see it, a ripple. Not random, not wind. It cut across the surface in a slow, purposeful line, heading toward the shore where the children stood. Martin froze the image. The ripple's leading edge had an odd geometry. Something just beneath the surface, pushing forward with unnatural stillness. And then another splice. 3 full seconds gone. Not one frame. Not accidental. The cut was even cleaner than the first. When the footage resumed, Emily and Peter were several feet back from the water, Thomas's hand gripping Peter's shoulder firmly. Eleanor's gaze was no longer on the creek. It was aimed at whoever was holding the camera. Even in silence, Clara could feel the weight of that look. It wasn't fear alone. It was recognition. Martin leaned back, exhaling through his teeth. 2 splices, 2 different reels, both from the same day. Whoever cut them knew exactly what they were removing. Samuel tapped his knuckles on the table, deep in thought. The first cut, frame 247, was about someone in the trees. This one was about something in the water. Or someone, Clara said softly. The implications crawled under her skin. The missing frame might have shown the figure's face, but what had these missing seconds captured? A crossing. A body being pulled under. Or something that could never be explained without seeing it move. And why had Harold Wexler, or anyone, kept both reels? If the goal had been to erase, why not destroy them entirely? Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the splices weren't just removal. They were control. Someone deciding exactly how much the world was allowed to know. That night, she replayed the creek scene in her mind, the ripple approaching like a slow heartbeat. In her imagination, the missing seconds didn't end in silence. They ended in the splash of water and a scream swallowed by the storm. But imagination was all she had. And whoever had taken those 3 seconds intended to keep it that way. The silhouette in frame 246 had been haunting Clara for days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it. Tall, motionless, watching. Samuel had been quiet since the second splice was found. It wasn't until 3 days later, sitting at the same diner booth they'd used as their informal headquarters, that he finally slid a manila folder across the table toward her. The folder was worn, its edges curling. Inside were photocopies of old police reports, a hospital intake form, and a grainy mugshot. The name at the top read Jonas Kearney. Kearney had grown up in Alder Creek in the 1940s, A childhood marked by fights at school, disappearances from home, and short bursts of manual labor in town before being fired for erratic behavior. By 1964, he'd been arrested twice, once for trespassing on private property at night, and once for menacing behavior toward a woman walking home. In 1967, a year after the Marwicks vanished, Kearney was committed to the state psychiatric hospital. His records, sparse as they were, contained notes about persistent delusions concerning the purification of Alder Creek and fixation on the concept of drowning as cleansing. Clara stared at the mugshot. The man's face was long, his eyes oddly deep-set, the jawline sharp. It was hard to tell his height from the photo, but the posture matched the figure in the trees. Samuel flipped to another page, a transcript from an interview with a hospital psychiatrist in 1968. Do you remember the summer of 1966? The water was loud that year. It called them. I just helped them hear it. Clara's stomach turned. This was never in the official investigation. Samuel shook his head. Kearney was questioned, but without physical evidence they let him go. By the time they looked at him seriously, he was already in the hospital. And the town didn't want it to be him. His family had deep roots here. They decided to cross-reference his appearance with community photos from the week of the disappearance. It took hours in the library archives, combing through newspapers and dusty scrapbooks, before they found it, a candid shot from the church picnic on July 28, 1966, the day before the Marwicks were last seen. In the background, half hidden behind a tent pole, stood Jonas Kearney. Tall, watching. But the deeper they dug, the murkier it became. A handful of locals admitted quietly that they'd seen Kearney near the creek that summer, but not on the day itself. Others claimed he had been away, working in another county. No two timelines matched exactly. Clara found herself caught in a strange limbo. The figure in frame 246 looked like Kearney. His record suggested he was capable of something terrible. But without the missing frame, without those lost 3 seconds by the water, there was no certainty, only the awful, tantalizing nearness of it. That night, she sat on her porch, listening to the faint rush of wind through the trees. Samuel's words from earlier echoed in her mind. Sometimes the truth is just close enough to touch. But you have to ask yourself, if you touch it, what happens next? For Clara, the answer was already unfolding. She wasn't just trying to solve a mystery from 1966 anymore. She was standing face to face with a shadow that still reached into the present, and giving it a name meant it might reach back. The decision to show the restored reels to the public was not unanimous. Some in Alder Creek muttered that digging it up again would only stir trouble. Others, mostly the younger generation, wanted the truth whatever it looked like. In the end, Samuel arranged a private viewing in the back room of the town library. The walls smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. Folding chairs were set up in 2 neat rows, facing a portable screen. Only a dozen people came. Mostly older residents. Mostly faces Clara recognized from her interviews. Martin handled the projection. He dimmed the lights, and the reels began to spin. The room filled with the soft whir of the projector, the flickering images casting ghost shadows across the audience's faces. The Marwicks came alive again on screen, running through the grass, laughing by the creek, the moments now painfully precious in their ordinariness. When frame 246 appeared, the figure in the trees, Clara felt a ripple of movement through the room. People shifted, inhaled sharply. And then the splice. The blink into absence. Frame 248. The gap seemed louder than the film itself. From the back row, a voice spoke, tremulous but steady. I remember that frame. Every head turned. It was Margaret Kearney, Jonas's older sister, now well into her 80s. She sat with her hands folded over her cane, her eyes fixed on the blank space between the frames. I saw it before Harold cut it, she continued. He brought the reel to our house. Wanted my father to see something. Her voice wavered. It was the children, Emily and Peter. They were looking straight at the camera. But their faces, they weren't laughing. Their eyes were wide, mouths open, like they'd just seen something behind the person filming. Clara's pulse quickened. And who was filming? she asked softly. Margaret hesitated. It wasn't Thomas. I knew Thomas. This man was taller, thinner. His clothes were wet like he'd come out of the creek. And he was smiling just barely. The room was silent, except for the steady hum of the projector. Margaret's gaze didn't leave the screen. Harold cut it because he said the town couldn't handle what was on it, that it would ruin families. He burned the frame in our fireplace that night. Clara felt the weight of those words settle over her like cold ash. The missing image wasn't just proof, it was a wound, deliberately cauterized. Not to heal, but to keep the infection of truth from spreading. When the reel ended, no one moved. The audience sat in the dim room, caught between relief and a fresh ache, as if they'd all been reminded of something they'd tried to forget. Margaret finally stood, leaning on her cane. It's not the water that haunts Alder Creek, she said quietly. It's what we let live beside it. Then she left, the echo of her steps as sharp as the click of the projector being switched off. The reels were no longer just film. They had become a mirror, one that didn't just reflect the Marwicks, but everyone in Alder Creek who had looked away. In the weeks after the library viewing, word spread quietly. The sheriff's office reviewed the restored footage along with Samuel's notes and Margaret Kearney's statement. It was enough for them to reclassify the Marwick case from unresolved disappearance to probable homicide. Person of interest identified. But no charges were filed. Jonas Kearney had been dead for 30 years, his medical records long sealed. There would be no trial, no arrest. Only the official line, case closed. Clara stood in the records room the day the file was stamped and shelved. The folder slid into place with a soft thud, indistinguishable from the hundreds around it. Something about that sound felt final and wrong. She still had the reels. Martin had offered to store them in his climate-controlled workshop, but Clara refused. They're part of Alder Creek's history, she told him. They should stay here. So she brought them to the local archive, where they were sealed in acid-free envelopes, labeled, catalogued, and locked in a drawer marked private collection. The archivist asked her if she wanted a plaque, a brief summary of their significance for future researchers. Clara thought about it. About putting the Marwicks' names in neat black letters under museum glass. But the idea felt wrong. Instead, she wrote only 4 words on the index card that would accompany them. Summer 66. Marwick. Let the story spread through whispers, the way it always had. On her last night in Alder Creek, Clara walked to the edge of the creek bank. The air was heavy with the scent of wet leaves. The water moved slowly under the moon, its surface black and glassy. She thought of the missing frame, the missing seconds. How they would never be recovered. How even with all they'd found, the truth was still stitched together with gaps and shadows. But she also thought of Emily's hair catching the light, of Peter's grin, of Eleanor's careful smile. She thought of the way the camera had caught them, not as victims, but as a family, alive and whole in that sliver of summer. The reel had given them back, if only for a flicker. Somewhere behind her a branch snapped. Clara turned, but the bank was empty. The sound was gone. She waited a moment longer, then let out the breath she'd been holding. The town would sleep tonight the same way it always had, with the creek whispering in the dark, carrying away what it refused to return. Clara left Alder Creek on a gray morning, the kind where the clouds seemed to hang low enough to brush the rooftops. Her car was packed, the reels now out of her hands and sealed in the town archive. The road-out wound passed the same wheat fields the Marwicks had once driven by. It struck her that they had left this town too, one July afternoon, only they had never returned. In the passenger seat sat the small notebook she'd filled during the investigation. The ink smudges and hastily scribbled lines felt almost alive now, as if they contained more than facts. They contained the weight of every pause, every look away, every silence she had coaxed from the town. She told herself she would put it all into a formal account someday. But deep down, she knew she wouldn't. The truth she'd found was too fractured to fit neatly into pages. It belonged here, in Alder Creek's soil and water, in its shadows and whispers. Back in town, the reels rested in their acid-free envelopes, tucked away in a climate-controlled drawer. No one was looking at them. No projector was running. Yet Clara imagined that if she stood very still in that archive, she might hear them anyway, the faint click of sprockets, the low hum of light pushing through dust. In her mind, she could see the flicker on the screen. Emily and Peter running through the grass, Eleanor shading her eyes against the sun, Thomas lifting the picnic blanket. And somewhere between the frames, the shadow in the trees, the ripple in the water. Always there. Always just out of reach. That night, hundreds of miles away, Clara lay in bed with the window open. A faint breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the smell of rain. She thought of the creek, of the way water could remember things the land could not. Somewhere in the unlit attic of Alder Creek's memory, the missing frame still existed. Not in celluloid, but in the minds of those who had seen it, and in the quiet spaces between what people chose to say. Stories don't end, she realized. They just settle like dust in a shaft of light. And if you stand there long enough, watching the air, you might see them move again. Now the mystery was archived. But it would never be still.